So I want to welcome you all to this year's first Speaking of Books event, which was begun by the libraries in 2005 to showcase some of the excellent research that is being published by faculty right here on our own campus. And it's with great pleasure that I introduce Robert S. Levine. Dr. Levine is a professor of English and distinguished university professor at the University of Maryland, College Park. He's the author of the following books: Conspiracy and Romance, Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, and the Politics of Representative Identity, and Dislocating Race and Nation. He's also the editor or co-editor of over 15 volumes, including Martin R. Delany, A Documentary Reader, Hemispheric American Studies, a cultural and critical edition of Frederick Douglass's The Heroic Slave, and the Norton Anthology of American Literature, for which he served as the general editor for the 2007, 2012, and 2016 editions. He's received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the Guggenheim Foundation. His new book, which is the subject of his talk today, is The Lives of Frederick Douglass. Now, I wanted to mention that in 2013, Dr. Levine was awarded an incredible prize, the J.B. Hubbell Medal for Lifetime Achievement in American Literary Scholarship from the American Literature section of the Modern Language Association. This prize is given each year to a scholar who's made an extraordinary contribution to the study of American literature over the course of his or her career. And at the awards ceremony, there was a 2-page citation that was read, and I got a copy of this. And I am going to read just a short excerpt of it to give everyone an idea, a little glimpse into Professor Levine's incredible contributions to the field. So I quote, "Whether in his consideration of the tensions between Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, or in his assessment of the congruencies between the lives and writings of Douglass and Herman Melville, or in his hemispheric remapping of the literary and cultural terrain that defines the field, Professor Levine has worked to embrace and elucidate the complexity of American literature and literary history. More significantly, Professor Levine has approached scholarship as a collective endeavor. Although he is one of the few scholars who can claim real authority as a scholar of white American and African American writers, and although he seems almost supernaturally aware of every development in the field as soon or even before it arrives, the hallmark of Professor Levine's career has been his collaborative work. One sees this in the many books he has co-edited. To look at Professor Levine's broad and deep body of scholarship is to look at a community of scholars engaged in genuine, purposeful, and productive scholarly exchange. And as anyone who has been involved in these and other projects will attest, in these collaborations, Professor Levine has always been both a sure guide and a deeply interested student, ready to embrace the unexpected, to turn to new questions, or to reframe even his own sense of where the project might go. It is this deep involvement in the many intertwined traditions that make up American literary history that made Professor Levine the natural choice for his current role as the general editor of the Norton Anthology of American Literature. This distinguished appointment requires a scholar equally comfortable with the global and the local, with theoretical nuances and historical details, and especially someone who can address the realities of emerging traditions pressing against traditional formulations. Professor Levine is that scholar." End of quote. Today, Dr. Levine will discuss The Lives of Frederick Douglass, published this year by Harvard University Press, after which there'll be ample time for questions, discussion. Copies of the book are available in the back for sale at the bargain price, hardback book, scholarly edition of $30, and Dr. Levine will be pleased to sign them after the presentation. So please help me in welcoming Bob.
Thanks, Pat, for the great introduction, and thanks for coming. The weather isn't so good. WTOP is predicting tornadoes, and here you are. So I want to thank Pat and the committee that put this together. It's a real honor to be speaking during Black History Month, in the month that Douglass was born, and also in the academic year when we unveiled the sculpture, the statue to Frederick Douglass. So it's great to be here. I've been working on Frederick Douglass for around 25 years, and this book is the culmination of that work. So what I want to do today is give you some sense of how I got interested, passionately interested, in Frederick Douglass and how this book came into being. And so I'm going to give you a kind of biography of my book, The Lives of Frederick Douglass. And this is opposed to my initial plan of just meticulously marching you through each chapter. And Pat said, no, don't do that. So if you are here for a meticulous march through each chapter, and you're not going to get it, we know who to blame. So I want to take you back to 1990. I was working on a book called Temperance in 19th Century American Literature. I had an NEH grant to do this book. The grant came with a letter from Lynn Cheney, and I thought, yeah, this is the kind of thing that Lynn Cheney would want, a book on temperance, which for the undergraduates here, it's all about not drinking, that kind of thing. So I was working on this book. I had a kind of draft of a chapter on Benjamin Franklin, and I thought I'd turn to Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass really liked Benjamin Franklin, and I think in some ways modeled the 1845 narrative on Franklin's autobiography. So I went back and read the narrative and thought about it in relation to temperance, and then I did the next bold and exciting thing, and that is I went to the Library of Congress and I got the microfilm of Frederick Douglass's newspapers, the North Star and Frederick Douglass's papers. So that takes you from about 1847 to 1860, and I started reading around looking for stuff about temperance, and I found a lot of stuff about temperance. Douglass had little squibs in there. It's not just about not drinking, it's about cleanliness, it's about hygiene. He was urging free blacks to brush their teeth once or twice a day, and that's right in there in the newspaper. He was talking about how wasteful it was to spend money on alcohol, so there's a lot about black uplift. So I found all of that very interesting. But as I'm reading around, I found stuff that I thought was a lot more interesting. I had kind of stepped into the world of 19th century African American debate and was discovering a whole bunch of new figures. I was finding that Douglass was writing about women's rights. He was writing about every political and social development that was happening in the 1840s and 1850s. He was writing very enthusiastically about Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I thought that all black people hated Uncle Tom's Cabin, so this was news to me. And I also saw he was writing about debates about black immigration, black colonization, and I found that he was doing a lot of debating with someone named Martin Delany, who I had never heard of. And I started getting pulled in that direction. I wanted to know more about Martin Delany. Martin Delany was a black nationalist who had come from Pittsburgh, who was Douglass's co-editor at the start of the North Star in 1847, and I didn't know that. And Delany specifically is debating Douglass about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Delany hated it, Douglass loved it, and they're debating about black immigration. Delany is in favor of it. He thinks it would give blacks a sense of their free rights to move around and look for political power. And Douglass was opposed to it. He thought it was a form of colonization. And so I got so interested in this stuff, I decided no more temperance book, which was good because then I could start drinking again. And I decided on a book on Martin Delany and Frederick Douglass. And I think one of the interesting things I'd say about all this is that I did this research before the accessible archives and kind of searching that you can do online. And I think that if I had done that kind of searching, I would have put in some key terms and got a whole bunch of really interesting stuff and then written the temperance book. But there was something about having access to the whole newspaper that just brought that world alive for me. And I just stayed with Douglass. I mean, I have lots of other interests. I've published a lot on Melville, for example. But I left the Temperance Project. I wrote a book on Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany. I did a book on co-edited a book on Frederick Douglass and Herman Melville. I co-edited a book on an edition of The Heroic Slave, which is Douglass's one work of fiction, in novella from 1853 that came out last year, and I think a few undergraduates here are working with that edition this semester. I wrote a whole bunch of essays and chapters. I have a chapter on Douglass and Haiti in my most recent book, and I wanted to stick with Douglass. And one of the things that really interested me about Douglass, kind of going back to 1990, was the role of, or the place of the narrative in his career. So Douglass, as probably most of you know, was born in 1818 in the Eastern Shore, made an escape from Baltimore in 1838. In 1841, he's in New Bedford. He meets William Lloyd Garrison, white abolitionist, becomes part of his Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. 1845, he publishes the narrative with William Lloyd Garrison, and that's the canonical text. It's short, it's powerful, it's a great slave narrative. Frederick Douglass died in 1895, so we're talking about a 50-year gap in his life that people weren't really paying as much attention to. And I think that those 50 years are really important and becomes an important part of my book. So I came up with the idea of writing a book that explored the question of how the narrative became iconic. When was it kind of invented, almost, or constructed as the key text of Douglass's? And one little fact I can give you is that it was published in 1845. It was reprinted a number of times, up to 1851, and then was out of print until 1960. So that's an over 100-year gap. And so what happened? So there's a book series at Yale called Icons of America. And I put together a book proposal that would explore the narrative as an American icon. I thought it was pretty good. I emailed it to the editor-in-chief, and 2 weeks later got a form letter rejecting it. So I just want you to know these things happen. So I was kind of thinking about, what would be the good place to publish, and I thought Harvard, because when the narrative was reissued in 1960, it was published through the John Harvard Library series at Harvard. And not only that, I had just edited a John Harvard Library edition for Harvard, an edition of Blithedale Romance. I'm thinking, why didn't I think of that? So I contacted the person who had got me to do that John Harvard Library edition, and I proposed the book, and he said, this seems really good, but why not enlarge it? Like, do the whole 20th century response to Douglass, and why just focus on the narrative? And I said, okay, that's good, I'll do that. And so I got the contract, I then got a Guggenheim to write this book, and just as a postscript, 2 weeks after I got the form rejection from Yale, I got an email from Yale saying, we made a mistake, we're interested. So I just thought I should throw that in, but too late for Yale. So I started to do this book on the 20th century construction of Douglass. And as I'm working on it, like every time I was reading critics on Douglass, I thought, that's interesting. But when I would go back to Douglass, I thought, that's more interesting. And so I got pulled more and more back into the 19th century. And I thought, really, the book I want to write is about Douglass's autobiographies, about all of his autobiographies, the 1845 narrative, the 1855 My Bondage and My Freedom, the 1881 Life and Times, the 1892 revision and expansion of Life and Times. And I wanted to expand the whole idea of what an autobiography is, because Douglass has tons of autobiographical essays, autobiographical lectures, and I also think, as some of you know, that the novella, the 1853, The Heroic Slave, is a kind of autobiographical narrative. So I came up with a new idea for a project, which is to say that as with the Temperance book, I threw it aside, and I decided to write what I am calling kind of like a biography of Douglass that's essentially a biography of Douglass's autobiographies, and that's kind of literary biography, that's what I'm doing. And I think that you can kind of pick up my sense of how I write a book. It's that I become really into a particular project And that's the way I discover what I really want to do. And it's a kind of weird thing. So from temperance to Douglas and Delaney, and from the 20th century construction of Douglas to kind of a reading of Douglas, a kind of new kind of literary biography of Douglas. So what I now want to do, kind of turn to, is the book itself. I'm not going to give you that meticulous chapter by chapter sense of what I do, but in some ways I want to tell you the story that I tell in the book. I'm going to do it in a condensed fashion. And for me, one of the fun things about this book, and different things for me about the book, is that it was contracted with a trade editor. And so, as opposed to my other books with North Carolina and Cambridge, where they're saying if we can only sell 500 copies of the book, we can say we've triumphed. They wanted to actually sell in 4 figures, which for academic work is a lot. And so I had an editor who was a hands-on editor, which I have not had at university presses. At university presses, I've had editors who kind of facilitate the whole process, but they don't sit down with it and go through it chapter by chapter. So what this editor would do is say, you've lost the story. I want the story. Bring the story out to the surface, and that's why I'm using this term story. I mean, it's still, as you'll see if and when you read it, it's a very literary and in some ways academic book, but I try to tell a story that will engage more than, say, 500 readers or engage more than specialists. So I begin the book with the narrative itself. And the introduction is basically the book that I initially thought I was going to write. So I start out with how is it that the narrative became so important to our understanding of Douglas, and what is it that we lose when that's basically the big focus of Douglas studies. And so there's an effort to recuperate, or kind of understand how it is that we went from this idea that Douglas was a great 19th century orator to Douglas was a great 19th century writer. And that was a process that was pretty slow. And I looked closely at a particular early African-American critic, Brawley, I'm blanking on his first name, who has like 15 histories of African-American literature, and it takes him a while to get there to Douglas as a writer. It starts out that Douglas is just kind of an orator. Then he starts looking at My Bondage and My Freedom. He doesn't look at the narrative. So it's the republication in 1960 of the narrative in the John Harvard Library series that I think was huge. And the timing, the moment was right. It's the civil rights movement, and people are reading this book and kind of debating how, what is he saying? And you find Martin Luther King looking back to Douglas and saying, it's about kind of nonviolence in some ways. You have Malcolm X looking back and saying, I see some violence, but in some ways, not enough. I don't like this guy. So there's a very interesting debates in the 1960s. There's also a kind of canonization in, you could say, white culture. The 1960s sees Douglas getting on the cover of Life magazine, which, if you're as old as I am, everyone was reading back then. There was a Frederick Douglass stamp. There was a lot of Frederick Douglass namings during the 1960s. So I start there, and then I go back to the 1840s and say, okay, we have this canonical text, but how might we read it historically? And what I suggest in that opening chapter is to read the narrative in relation to William Lloyd Garrison and in relation to Douglas's incredible excitement of being part of Garrison's anti-slavery organization. And to think of that organization itself as offering him a kind of writing workshop. And this might not seem such a radical suggestion, except that Douglas in the 1850s, in My Bondage and My Freedom, basically turned on Garrison, famously said that Garrison and his associates told me to give the facts but don't do analysis. And so people have read the narrative kind of making arguments that Douglas is working with, but also very much against Garrison. And I don't see it. I see the book's prefaces and the conclusions and what goes on in that text just reinforcing the excitement that Douglass has of being part of that organization as he's learning to become an effective reader and writer. And I found some letters that are kind of fascinating in which Douglass is saying, I need help writing, I need help editing. I mean, he is still learning. So the exciting story, because I think that's less exciting, even though for me it's exciting because it's a revisionary argument about the importance of reading this autobiography in relation to Garrison and not as some sort of angry, ironic distance. And I think there's everywhere I looked at Douglass in the 1841 to 1845 period when he's with Garrison, he is allowed to analyze. No one is stopping him from analyzing. The exciting story, I think, starts in 1845. The narrative is a bestseller of sorts in its own time, which means that Douglass, who is still a fugitive slave, is vulnerable to be caught by slave catchers. So he takes a ship, the Cambria, to Liverpool, makes his way to Ireland, and is abroad for 2 years. And what I argue is that it's during these 2 years that he becomes a really independent thinker. He doesn't have Garrison watching over him. He's interacted with a whole bunch of different anti-slavery organizations. He's feeling the excitement of being an anti-slavery leader among the Anglo-American group of reformers. And as part of that excitement, he decides that he wants to do his own edition of the narrative in Ireland. And he works with someone named Richard Webb, and he brings out what people now call the Dublin editions of the narrative. And for me, they're really significant. They've been neglected, and I try to kind of recuperate those texts. So basically what Douglass does in those narratives is he usurps Garrison. In the 1845 edition that you all will read, Garrison introduces him. You can seem kind of patriarchal and paternalistic, and I think he was, but I think at the time maybe Douglass wasn't, super upset about that. But by 1845 to 1847 he is. So Douglass writes the prefaces. Douglass creates new appendices. Douglass oversees the images that go on the text. Douglass is super excited about doing that. There's a whole bunch of surviving letters. And I think that those editions are different from what we're used to looking at. 1847, Douglass comes back to the United States, and the first thing that he does is he sets up his own newspaper called the Liberator, called North Star. Garrison's newspaper is called the Liberator. Garrison is furious, and there is not a formal break between the two people until 1851, when Douglass gives a series of speeches about why he broke with Garrison. But privately, they had broken, and Douglass had gone out on his own. So where I kind of end that chapter is with Douglass's publication, decision to do his own black newspaper, the significance of that, and his movement towards a politics very different from Garrison's. And one of Garrison's key kind of tenets, beliefs, was the importance of what he called moral suasion, nonviolence. Douglass increasingly is arguing that violence makes sense, because slavery itself is a violent institution. So if you just read the narrative, you're reading a text in which Douglass is being kind of careful to stay on the Garrisonian position, which means that when Douglass uses violence against Covey, the slave breaker, it's a very restrained, self-defensive violence. 1851, Douglass breaks with Garrison, and so now I'm taking you as following the story to the third chapter, in which Douglass is now thinking about, the value of using violence to fight against slavery. He is also arguing for the value of political process. Garrison had argued, don't even participate in politics because the whole nation is corrupt. Douglass becomes involved with a man named Gerrit Smith, who's a kind of free soiler or kind of radical abolitionist, who begins to fund his newspapers. And I'm interested in how all of this kind of works in relation or informs Douglass's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. which I see as an autobiography where Douglas is much more aggressive in arguing for violence. He's aggressive in his anger against William Lloyd Garrison, and he also presents himself, as opposed to the narrative where he's kind of an individualist, as linked with a larger black diaspora. So I see all of that going on. And so I just wanted to give two quotes from Douglas to kind of point to his shift in thinking about violence, and then relate this to a couple of things that I think people here have been reading, particularly some of the undergraduates. So in 1846, when he is still a Garrisonian, he gives a lecture called My Opposition to War. He gives this in London. And what he says is, quote, "Such is my deep, firm conviction that nothing can be attained for liberty universally by war, that were I to be asked the question as to whether I would have my emancipation by the shedding of one single drop of blood, my answer would be in the negative," end quote. During the 1850s, during the fugitive slave controversy, there's a fugitive slave hunter is killed in Boston in 1854. Douglas participates in some of these rallies. And what he says, and I'm quoting, "His slaughter was as innocent in the sight of God as would be the slaughter of a ravenous wolf in the act of throttling an infant," end quote. So what really interests me in the book is, so for those of you who have read or have been reading The Heroic Slave, is that Douglas becomes really interested in an 1841 slave rebellion, the Creole Rebellion. This is a ship that's going from Virginia to New Orleans. The leader of the rebellion is Madison Washington. One white officer is killed, and the crew is able to get to the British Bahamas. And this happens in 1841. It's actually the same year that Douglas hooks up with Garrison. And Douglas starts giving a series of lectures about Madison Washington. He kind of, I think, identifies with him, empathizes with him, at times I think almost sees himself as potentially a Madison Washington figure. And this all culminates, I mean, it's a bunch of lectures, both in England and in the United States. This all culminates in his novella of 1853, The Heroic Slave, which features a rebellious slave named Madison Washington. It's about the Creole Rebellion. It's kind of historical novella. And I think it's really invested with a sense that Douglas and Washington are kind of the same. And it's interesting to see how Washington at times talks like Frederick Douglass. And so I read that novella autobiographically. I use that reading to kind of move into My Bondage and My Freedom, and to read similar themes about rebellion and black community, and a kind of a shift in evaluating to violence that leads eventually to Douglas talking very seriously to John Brown about his plans to attack Harper's Ferry. The other thing that I would just quickly comment on is the role of Garrison in My Bondage and My Freedom. Garrison is presented as totally racist in that book, exemplifying racism. And it's worth knowing that when Douglas broke with Garrison formally in 1851, Garrison started writing editorials about Douglas in the Liberator, suggesting pretty strongly that Douglas was having sexual relations with his white British managing editor named Julia Griffiths. And things got really nasty between Douglas and Garrison. And I find that stuff kind of fascinating, I have to say. And there's a kind of rivalry there as well between Garrison and James and Gerrit Smith, the person that Douglas started working with and actually getting funding for from his newspaper in the 1850s. The story that I then follow draws a lot from Douglas's really pretty much neglected these days Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. So he publishes this autobiography in 1881. He revises and updates in 1892. And it's the only place that you could read about Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. It's the only place that you can read about Frederick Douglass in terms of his autobiographies, and Frederick Douglass and John Brown. And it has a host of other interesting things as well that allow me to kind of continue telling a story about Douglass's life and about the way that Douglass told the story about his life. And I decided to focus on two key aspects. So one big chapter that tends to play well out in the real world is on Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, because people seem not to be able to get enough about Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. And I'm a real revisionist critic as far as that story goes. But basically the story that has emerged with the help of books by James Oakes and others is that Douglass and Lincoln were pretty much friends and collaborators during the Civil War. And I found a whole lot of evidence that that wasn't true. Where it seems that they're friends and collaborators is in the life and times of Frederick Douglass, because in 1881 it made really good sense for Douglass to present himself as a friend and collaborator with the dead, martyred president. But the fact of the matter is they met only 3 times during the Civil War, over 3 years, for less than an hour, as far as I can figure out. And most of what Douglass wrote about Lincoln during that time was highly critical. He compares him to Jefferson Davis, and at one point has a speech where he says we would have been better off if Jefferson Davis was the president, as opposed to Abraham Lincoln. He is furious that Lincoln has nothing to say about the New York City draft riots. He is furious that Lincoln seems to be doing everything that he can to accommodate the border state slave states. And he's furious that Lincoln still seems throughout his career, his presidency, but especially in 1862 and 1863, to be supporting black colonization. Lincoln came up with a plan that he championed, especially in 1862, to send blacks to Central or South America. And so there's a whole bunch of critical stuff that Douglass wrote. There's also stuff that it's autobiographical. He talks about his meetings with Lincoln, but he's kind of jocular about it. And there's the hierarchy there is more like Douglass talking down to Lincoln, whereas in the autobiography, it's the other way around. So what I try to do is take all of this material and create what my publisher calls a collage, like a kind of shifting sense of how to think about that relationship, which sometimes seems very troubled and sometimes doesn't, but is always really fascinating. But I think it's been mythologized by historians, and one of my big arguments is that Douglass is responsible for the mythologizing of that relationship, and that mythologizing began at the moment when Lincoln was killed. And so I look at some of the speeches that Douglass gives in that immediate few months afterwards, which completely revise everything that he'd been saying about Lincoln critically during the Civil War. And then I look at what I think is Douglass's most fascinating speech about Abraham Lincoln. It's the 1876 speech at the Freedmen's Monument, when Douglass, before every famous person in Washington, including the president and his cabinet, declares that Lincoln was, quote, the white man's president, and then goes on to say, even though he was a racist, he did great things. And it's a very complex historical appreciation, ultimately, of how a man who could be the white man's president was able to do good things as well. But I think it's actually, I think that's where Douglass is at his most interesting with Lincoln. So I have all this stuff that I put into play, and then I was at a presentation that Ed Lee Wong did earlier today, where we were talking about I can't pronounce the word, triangulation. It's a chapter that actually works with triangulation, because I thought, wouldn't it be interesting in this long chapter to also talk about Douglass and John Brown? And I'm able to show, and to me this was a really fascinating discovery, that a lot of times when Douglass wrote or spoke about Lincoln, he wrote or spoke about John Brown at the same time. And my argument is that Brown kind of haunts Lincoln, in the sense that Douglass saw Brown as willing to use violence, as caring about black people, and as not a racist. And as much as Douglass came to like Lincoln, I think he always thought that he was a racist, that he was anti-slavery, but that there was a certain racism. So I think that makes the chapter more interesting to have John Brown play into that. And then the final chapter before the epilogue, I take a moment that is, to me, super fascinating, and that's in 1877, Douglass returns to the Eastern Shore to meet with his former master, Thomas Auld. And as Douglass presents it in Life and Times, Thomas Auld is about to die. And it's this great moment of reconciliation. They hold hands, they weep, and it seems like this great interracial moment of forgiveness and love, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a whole bunch of descriptions of that account, and I don't quite buy, or I don't want to buy the account that has it, that Douglass went back to apologize, to find peace with the master forgives him for running away, and so on. So what I do in this in another kind of big chapter is I look at everything that Douglass wrote about Thomas Auld, everything. And I look at all of the different versions of this meeting, including those that occurred, that were written up in the Baltimore Sun, that I would not have been able to find without the help of Pat Herron. Thank you, Pat. You see that, well, maybe Douglass wasn't crying. Maybe they weren't holding hands. Hey, look at this. Auld didn't die either. He didn't die for 3 more years. And isn't it fascinating that Douglass developed a friendship, I think a genuine friendship, with Thomas Auld's daughter. And Douglass had written an essay called Letter to His Former Master, in which he says to his former master, in his usual friendly, playful way to Thomas Auld, how would you like it if I raped your daughter? With the argument being, black women are being raped by their masters. How would you like if this sort of thing was happening to you? So I see a long history of tension and conflict. And even when you look at the descriptions of Thomas Auld in Life and Times, it's critical from beginning to middle, except that final scene. You have the friendship. And so one of the big arguments I make in the book is that Douglass as an autobiographer is often a performer. He's a rhetorician. He wants stories to do particular things at particular moments. I think at this particular moment, kind of Reconstruction having problems, he is reasserting his own power, his desire to be part of the South, his desire to be part of Maryland. He's laying claim to Maryland. He returns to talk to Thomas Auld when he is the Marshal of the District of Columbia. He's a man of honor, he's a man of prominence, he's a man of power. And in the autobiography, there's, for me, a comical moment when he remarks on the death of Thomas Auld. And he said, hey, did you notice, and I'm paraphrasing, did you notice, all the obituaries say that he was my former master. You know, his claim to fame was his relationship to me. And for me, this is a really crucial moment in Douglass's life and in the historiography of Douglass' biography, because the last big, good biography of Douglass was written by William McFeely. It's called Frederick Douglass, published in 1991. And the large thesis of that book is that Douglass secretly wanted to be white. The thesis is that Douglass loved the Aulds loved Douglass, and it's a very white-centric reading of a Douglass that I don't recognize, from having worked with him in lots of different contexts. So I wanted to work against that. So my reading of that moment is a bit more ironic, but I still see it as a very serious moment where we see Douglass near the end of his life laying claim to the South and even kind of performing a kind of mastery over the former master. The master's lying in bed, and he's there in regalia, talking to him and supposedly crying and holding hands and so on. I then have a kind of a series of epilogues and codas that I just would touch on very, very quickly. I get in both my last book, Dislocating Race and Nation, and this book, I'm very interested in the fact that Douglass becomes ambassador to Haiti around 1890, and interested in what he does as ambassador, which is basically to join with the Haitians in opposing the US Navy's desire to gain a port at Haiti, which leads Douglass either to be fired or to resign, depending on who you read. But I see a more aggressively diasporic Douglass at the end of his life, and I see that informing the additions that he makes to the 1881 Life and Times in 1892. Complicating all this is the fact that in 1884, Douglass marries his white former secretary 2 years after the death of his wife, Anna Mari. So even as I see him identifying with Haiti in some ways, and Haiti repays him by making him their ambassador in 1893 at the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the representative of the Haitian Exposition. Even as he's going in that direction, he is dealing with a whole bunch of criticism from black people and white people about what are you doing? You married a white woman. So you see Douglass in the New York Times and elsewhere, and in the concluding sections of Life and Times, making these kind of post-racial arguments as well. And also, in a way, laying claim to his whiteness, because his master was white. And he would rhetorically say things like, well, I married a woman who was the color of my mother, and now I married a woman who was the color of my father. In the final section of my book, so I'm now at the conclusion of my story, I talk about Douglass's obsession with death. He writes a lot about death, in part because a lot of his abolitionist friends are dying between 1870 and his own death in 1895. And I talk about this in relation to Douglass as a writer, because I think by the end of his life, he becomes really committed to the idea that he's going to survive as a writer and not as an orator. And I think that's one reason why he wants to write this massive autobiography, Life and Times, which is over 600 pages near the end of his life. That would kind of keep him alive in certain ways. So that's where I end up. I'll just say that as I'm working on the book, I'm excited about, I get really excited about lots of different aspects of Douglass. I mean, I love his writing. I think he's a great writer. I think he's a great autobiographer. I think he's an incredible speaker. I love him also for all the reasons that we have the statue at the University of Maryland. He was a freedom fighter. He was fighting for black people. He was fighting for Asian Americans, as we learned from Edley's talk earlier today. He was fighting for women's rights. He had some arguments with feminists during the 19th century, but he attended the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention in the United States, and he dies hours after he attended a women's rights convention in 1895. What I wanted to conclude with just the concluding paragraph of the book, just to give you some sense of how I write and how I think about Douglass. So this is the final paragraph. In the final chapters of the 1892 Life and Times, and thus at the conclusion of his series of autobiographies, Douglass directly addresses the vanity and futility of human actions, the tenuousness of nations and institutions, and the mocking reality of death. On the level of sheer politics, Douglass also seems dumbfounded in 1892 by the persistence of white supremacy and racial hierarchies over the nearly 50 years from his first to last autobiography. Whether he is gazing at the Chesapeake, and he describes himself gazing at the Chesapeake in all three autobiographies as a slave, looking at the boats and wanting the freedom that those boats had. Sorry to interrupt myself. Whether he's gazing at the Chesapeake or imagining himself looking down on the world from a pyramid, which he does in 1885, there are complexities of desire and anxiety that inform all of Douglass's autobiographical writings and suggest the possibility of the imminent collapse of any particular construction of identity at any particular moment. In that light, perhaps the most heroic aspect of Douglas's efforts to write himself into being is his faith in writing itself. Beginning with his death in 1895, to circle back to the introduction of the study, Douglas has had a continued impact on American culture in large part because of his autobiographical writing, which for well over 100 years has made the posthumous Douglas a significant presence even beyond the United States. He is not dead, Langston Hughes asserts. Douglas's lives produced afterlives, conflicting, elusive, and inspirational, which are among his greatest legacies. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Eric's going to moderate.
Yeah, could you please use the microphone so we can hear the questions?
Did he ever keep a diary, for one thing? Another, what about Mark Twain? Was there any connection to Mark Twain?
I don't know about the connection with Mark Twain, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a connection. I'm not going to claim total knowledge, but I've read all these biographies. I haven't come across anything. We tell our grad students to kind of answer questions, kind of slide into something else that you know a little bit more about. So I'm going to do that here, and then I'll get to the diary. Because you could have asked, did he know Herman Melville? I mean, maybe you were tempted to do that. And
He described him as a performer, so that's why.
yeah, the performer would go back to the antebellum period and Daniel Webster and the whole age of oratory, where Douglas is, he's celebrated. I mean, in his own time, he's one of the absolute great orators. Douglas and Herman Melville overlapped in New Bedford for 2 weeks, which then became the kind of point of departure for a conference in 2005 that I co-directed on Melville and Douglas in a 500-page book of essays on Melville and Douglas. Did they ever meet? Who knows? Douglas reprinted one chapter in his newspaper, the North Star, from Melville's Typee, which was Melville's first novel, so that's really interesting to me. Douglas did keep a diary. They're off and on diaries. It's not like every day. Back in 1999 or 2000, I went to the Library of Congress and read his diary of his trip to Rome. And it was really fascinating. And I started out getting it in microfilm and I couldn't read it. And they actually brought me the diary. So it was like a holy sacred moment in my research on Douglas. And they were very short entries, but they got me into the way that he was thinking about race when he was going off to Rome and Egypt. So yeah, there's interesting diaries too. And what I think is a really great resource are his letters, which are slowly but surely being published by Yale University Press, and they're also available online, some of them through the Library of Congress. And for me, the most exciting discovery that I made in the final year of working on Douglas, so now I've gone from diaries to letters. So grad students who are going to be interviewed at MLA and elsewhere, this is what you do. So I was looking at letters of the Library of Congress, and I found a letter from Benjamin Auld to Frederick Douglass from around 1891. And Benjamin Auld, for those of you who know the narrative, is the son of Sophia Auld and Hugh Auld. Sophia Auld is the nice woman in Baltimore who tried to teach Douglas to read and write. Douglas, near the end of the Civil War, he wants to go visit them in Baltimore, and Benjamin Auld says, "Get away." And so he doesn't get to see them, and then they die shortly thereafter. He becomes a policeman in Baltimore. Some of the police in Baltimore have bad reputations these days, but in 1890 or 1891, Benjamin Auld writes Douglas from out of the blue and says that I was unfair to you, and I admire you, and I want us to have a friendship. And they never met, but they have this very interesting epistolary correspondence. And in the book, I argue that it's more moving in some ways than the hand-holding that's described in 1877, because it's a white person who's reaching out to Douglas. So yeah, there's letters, there's journals. I would bet he knew Twain. How could you not know who he was? But there was no friendship that I know of.
Other questions?
Did Frederick Douglass experience like a lot of harassment or violence, or people getting angry because he was so honest and he was writing and he was publishing? Did he have problems like that here in this country?
Yeah.
Okay,
So I'll elaborate on this. You can find violent or angry reactions to Douglass from the moment he enters the public scene. So famously, when somewhere in the 1841 to 1845 period, he's attacked and pretty seriously injured. And I'm not sure if it was Pennsylvania or Indiana, but all abolitionists were vulnerable to attack. So that's one thing that happens. When the narrative comes out in 1845, it's not that he's physically or violently attacked, he feels he has to run away, but his honesty is attacked by people from the Eastern Shore, saying, he's making everything up. And most famously, there was a letter by someone named A.C.C. Thompson, who was living in Delaware, who was from the Eastern Shore, who challenged Douglass in a kind of stupid letter. And Douglass, in a very intelligent letter, responds to that angry letter, and then he makes that part of his appendix to the Dublin Edition. All during the 1850s, he was really vulnerable to violence. I mean, he's fighting against the fugitive slave law, and he's vulnerable. The moment John Brown attacks Harper's Ferry, Douglass was suspected of being a co-conspirator, and if he was captured, he would have been hung. And so again, he goes abroad. When he comes back, the thing about Douglass after the Civil War is he does become a Republican functionary, and he speaks at Republican meetings, and he gets these honors from the District of Columbia. So I see less of the physical vulnerability, but a lot of anger directed at him when he marries a white woman, A. B, when he sides with Haiti. He's seen as a traitor, and he's attacked. And the other thing that I've learned about from other people working on Douglass is that a lot of African Americans in Washington, D.C. didn't like Douglass in the 1880s and 1890s because of his alliance with the Republican Party, because of the kind of wealth that's on display at Cedar Hill. He's up on the hill, and what is his connection to us? So I think ultimately he was energized by that kind of stuff. And it's earlier in his career where I think there's more of that physical vulnerability where he could have been seriously hurt. And there were abolitionists like Lovejoy who were killed.
Yeah, I was really interested in the part about his time abroad and how that really kind of opened up his thinking and kind of sharpened his perspective as a writer. And I was kind of curious if you could talk about that a little more, like if there were some other things that might have led to that, him really finding his voice while he was out of the country.
Yeah. I think, I make a bunch of arguments in that chapter, and one of them is that he had a key moment on the ship that was taking him to Liverpool. The ship was called the Cambria, where he was asked to talk about his experience of slavery. And he starts talking about slavery and attacking slavery, and it turned out there were a whole bunch of Southerners and pro-slavery people on board the ship. So in terms of your question about violence as well, they turn on Douglass rhetorically, and also there's a threat of physical violence. And the captain steps between them and seems to be on Douglass's side. So, what's the significance of all that for the development of him as a writer? What I show in the book is that as soon as he gets to England, he starts telling the story of the Cambria. And he tells it maybe 20 or 30 times, and the story keeps changing because more and more, he wants to show this as a key moment where he's speaking on his own, and he's able to face down pro-slavery people, but then he also makes it to a kind of British Empire story because he emphasizes that the captain is British and there's Irish on board the ship who are on his side. So what I argue, I'm not sure it's 100% true, but what I argue is that story told over and over and over is Douglass kind of honing his rhetorical techniques and figuring out, how can you tell the story to this particular audience in Dublin, for example, and this particular audience in Liverpool? He tells it differently. He's giving lectures for almost 2 years during that period. He is still a corresponding editor for the Liberator, Garrison's newspaper. So they haven't totally broken. But I think that being on his own and then having one big story that he could tell a lot, meant a lot, helped him to develop. The other story that he told a lot while he was abroad was the story of Madison, Washington. And he tells his first version of the Madison, Washington-led revolt on the Creole in 1845. And I think there's no coincidence, because this was a kind of tense moment in British-US relations, because the American government wanted those slaves back. And so they wanted the slaves back from the Creole, and they would have liked having Douglass back. So he tells a lot of stories about Madison, Washington as well. Then, I think when he returns in 1847, I mean, he's editor of a newspaper. Well, what does that mean? I mean, he's writing half of what's in there every week. And that's where I think you really see the writing develop, starting around 1847.
Who else has a question?
Hi.
Hi.
I was just wondering, this is more of an opinion question, I guess, but so you're talking about the idea that the Dublin edition is maybe more true to Douglass's original conception of what he would have wanted the narrative to be, but we continue to teach the original publication more often than not in sort of like academic circles. Do you think that we should be advocating more to teach the Dublin edition, or do you think that we should stick with the one that is more typically taught because that's sort of what became culturally relevant once we hit the 20th century?
Right. Okay, so that's a good question. I think that the 1845 edition published in Boston is what Douglass wanted published in 1845, and it's the text, the kind of founding text of every one of his autobiographies, including the Life and Times. My argument for the Dublin editions, it would be great if it was available more widely so people could look at particularly what I call the paratexts, working with the term from Gerard Genet, the prefatory material, the material on the cover page, the concluding material, the appendices, which are under Douglass's control and not under William Lloyd Garrison's control. I found a letter that Douglass wrote in which he said, I'm going to condense this. And we think of this as the short version. He actually pretty much left the narrative untouched. Once you get to the story itself, there's just some adoption of Britishisms and a couple of small changes. So I think that Douglass's experience with William Lloyd Garrison is of fundamental importance. I think that text is of fundamental importance, and it's the text that people were reading in the 1960s when Douglass was rediscovered. Cambridge University Press brought out a paperback edition of the first Dublin edition, which appeared later in 1845. It's probably priced, I mean, I bought a copy, but it's probably priced Cambridge style, like $30 to $40. So, no, I don't want you using that. Pat Heron helped me to find the second edition, so I didn't have to go to Dublin, though I would have liked to, I guess. And it's the second edition that I think is much more interesting, and it's pretty rare. And so I'd say if you become interested in Douglass, it's worth looking at that edition. But I would be more interested in comparing the prefaces and the appendices than saying, this is what he wants. And because I think what he wanted is what he published in 1845, and I think that's actually, believe it or not, a kind of radical argument to make. If you like Douglass, I think he would say, read My Bondage and My Freedom, because I wrote that and published that apart from Garrison, and I had my friend, James McCune Smith, African-American doctor and political thinker in New York, write the introduction. And it's more mine than that 1845. And then he would say, read the Life and Times, because that's my triumphant work. And I can say, in its own time, it failed financially. I mean, people weren't that interested in it. But interestingly, it was the one autobiography in print by Douglass until 1960. And then, and I have an edition from the 1940s of Life and Times. And My Bondage and My Freedom isn't reprinted until 1967. So you have, again, well over a 100-year gap between those printings. But the Life and Times was more out there. And that's actually how people knew Douglas in the 40s and 50s. It's a good question.
Well, I have one more question. Since we have told. What were the Western European and United Kingdom views on slavery?
What's the United Kingdom views on slavery?
Well, in Western Europe as well.
They were more progressive than the United States. I mean, just to stick with Great Britain, they had colonies in the Americas, and there are various anti-slavery measures that the British take, culminating in West Indies emancipation, depending on how you understand the date of 1836 or 1837. So what you have is the irony for a lot of British people in particular that the nation that thinks it's such a great Republican democratic nation is the nation with slavery, and we aren't. Spain, I think, continues its interest in slavery in the Americas for a while. France, less so. America doesn't look good, in this larger context. And the context I think most immediately interested Douglas as someone who traveled to England was the British context, and that the British had emancipated and the United States hadn't.
Can I ask you a question?
You have to go to the mic.
So were each of the successive autobiographies written anew, or did he import any material from one to the other, or were they all written from scratch? Or,
Okay, so the 1845 is fresh. The Dublin editions basically work with the core of the 1845 and change the appendices and prefaces. The 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom, is written fresh, and it has a whole bunch of new material. But what Douglas does, and I think there's still a good essay to be written about this, or chapter to be written about this, is at key moments he quotes from the earlier text. So what does he say? Is this the right way and the only way to put it, or am I giving you a sense of history, of how I thought about things 10 years earlier? And for me, the most vivid, I guess, is the 1855, My Bondage and My Freedom. But I fell in love with Life and Times because it's weird and bloated in a weird way. But so that one, no, he rewrites things. And of course, everything that happened, he writes about that happened between 1855 and 1881 is all fresh. So that's all new. Again, in the 1881-1892 edition, he quotes. And I think the quotes are always from the narrative. It's always going back to the narrative. There is something about that text that is core, that captures something either in his original kind of historical position, or, I love this phrase, and I think that one of the things that he does self-quote all the time is his description, Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, the description of the boats in the Chesapeake, I think, are in all three editions. And there I think he just thought, I wrote poetry, and why get rid of that?
Anybody else have a question?
I thought of one more. So I think Frederick Douglass, he talked about how iconic he is, and I feel like for so many people, what makes him so iconic is his intellect. And his incisive writing tone and style. I was curious though, if there's any glimpses into a sense of humor that might have come out. He was dealing with so many heavy things. I was curious, maybe if there was a sense of humor.
I don't have anything I can quote you, but I can tell you that he was known as a humorist. And particularly as a speaker, he was known to be great at imitating other people. And this may not put Douglas in such a good light, but the day he died, he had gone to a women's rights convention, and he comes back home and he starts imitating the women speakers, and people are laughing, and then he has a heart attack. So there's probably a lesson to be learned from that. Yeah, so what I've read in accounts of Douglass is that he was a really good mimic, and that he would make people laugh. And in the book, I guess the comic moment in the book that I could refer to is his description of his first meeting with Lincoln, where he describes him as a country bumpkin, and he said, what I have there is a quote from the newspaper account that inserts in parentheses laughter for every time people laughed as Douglass was talking. So I read this passage recently at a talk I gave at the Smithsonian, and so you read a sentence and he's like, laughter. And then you read another sentence and it says laughter. But it's basically, Lincoln is sitting in the presidential office with his feet up on a table, and Douglass comes in and he stands up, and it's almost like out of a cartoon, that he keeps getting taller and taller and taller as Douglass is watching him, and he's describing that, and then you have the newspaper reporter putting in the laughter. So yeah, I think he was funny. Maybe less so in something like The Narrative and even The Heroic Slave. But the orators had to be funny, I think, to succeed over 50 years.
Okay, do we have any other questions or comments?
What's your next book?
I don't have a big project. This will sound awful, but I was asked by Cambridge to collect my uncollected essays and make sense of them. So I'm going to do that. They want me to do it within a year, but that seems like fun. I publish these things over, so I'm going to update things. But they're essays. The title of the book is going to be let's see. Race, Transnationalism in 19th Century American Literary Studies. So I'm going to write an introduction that kind of frames the essays, and I'm going to frame each essay. And they want me to do 2 fresh essays and to update. I have 7 or 8 other essays that didn't become parts of books. And then I'll see if anyone has a big project that they think I could work on. I'd love to hear it.
Okay, why don't we thank Professor
Okay.
Levine.